Long before the first hero lifted a sword, the gods on the mountain had a problem. They were bored. They had thunder and nectar and endless time, and none of it meant anything, because nothing they did could ever cost them a thing. So they turned their eyes down to the short, breakable creatures below, and started keeping score. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight we step into the age of heroes, from a baby set adrift in a wooden box, to a man strangling a lion with his bare hands, to a ship full of legends chasing a golden sheepskin across the edge of the world. Before we sink in, one small thing. If these nights help you, a like and a subscribe mean a lot. No pressure. Only if it feels earned. And drop a comment. Which city are you in tonight? And what time is it there? I read every one. It's my favorite part of this. All right. Lights low. Fan on. If you like that soft hum, get heavy. Get comfortable. Tonight's story starts now. The wind comes off the water first. You can smell it before you see anything, salt and wet rope, and the faint tar they smear on the hulls to keep the sea out. Somewhere close, a wooden box knocks against a piling, over and over, hollow and patient. Inside it, if you leaned down and listened, you would hear a baby breathing. That box has no oars, no sail, no name painted on the side. Just a young mother folded around her son in the dark, praying to gods who put her there in the first place. The tide is going out. The box is going with it. This is how the age of heroes begins. Not with a trumpet, with a mother handing her child to the sea and hoping the sea is kinder than her father was. The Greeks did not invent heroes because they were happy. They invented them because the world was cruel and short and mostly indifferent, and they needed to believe that a single person standing in the wrong place at the worst moment could still matter, that a farmer's son could kill a monster, that a slave could become a king, that the gods, for all their thunder, could be argued with, tricked, outrun, and occasionally embarrassed. You have to understand what these people were living through. A bad harvest could erase a village. A fever could take half your children before spring. The sea that fed you also swallowed your husband and gave back nothing. Storms had faces. Plagues had reasons. And every reason led back up to the mountain, where beings the size of clouds decided your fate over dinner and rarely remembered your name. So the Greeks made a bargain with their own fear. They said, fine, if the world is going to be this dangerous, then let danger be where greatness is made. Let the monster in the cave be the reason a nobody becomes a name. Let the impossible task be the door, not the wall. That is what a hero was to them, not a good man. Half of them were terrible. A hero was a mortal who did something the gods themselves couldn't be bothered to do, and paid for it in a currency the gods would never have to. Spend, time, loss, and ending, because that was the one thing separating you from everything on that mountain. The gods went on forever. You did not. And somehow the Greeks decided that made you the interesting one. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful beings in their entire imagination, deathless, beautiful, unbothered, and the storytellers kept turning away from them to watch the humans instead. The ones who bled, the ones who aged, the ones who knew every single morning that they had fewer mornings left than they did yesterday. A god risking his life means nothing, because he has no life to lose. A man risking his life means everything, because that's all he has. The Greeks understood this better than almost anyone since. Courage only counts when the stakes are real, and the stakes are only real when the clock is running dot, so they filled their world with clocks. Every hero came with an ending already waiting for him somewhere down the road. A prophecy, a curse, a single crack in an otherwise perfect body. And the hero's whole life became the distance between the beginning and that ending, and what he chose to do with it. The gods watched all of this the way you might watch a candle burn, curious, a little wistful, reaching down now and then to tip it over or shield it from the wind, or simply see what the flame would do if they made the room a little darker. Some gods played favorites. A goddess might guide a young man through a nightmare because she liked his nerve, or because his enemy had insulted her once at a wedding. Divine help was rarely about mercy. It was about pride and grudges, and the endless family arguments of a family that could never die, and therefore never had to let anything go. And some gods played the other way. If a mortal grew too proud, too gifted, too loved, the mountain took notice. A hero who won too cleanly, who never wept, who started to sound like he thought he was one of them, would find the road ahead suddenly full of teeth. The gods gave greatness. They also quietly made sure it always came with a bill. This is the world you're stepping into tonight. A world where a princess gets chained to a rock to pay for her mother's boasting. Where a king sets a young man 12 impossible tasks and fully expects each one to be the last. Where a monster waits in the dark at the center of a maze, and the only thing standing against it is a boy with a ball of thread and no plan. He'd admit to out loud 4 heroes walk through the middle of it. A boy in a box dragged out of the sea. A giant of a man built for glory and cursed with a temper that ruins everything he touches. A prince who volunteers to be eaten just to prove a point. And a young captain who gathers the greatest crew ever, assembled, and sails straight off the edge of the map to steal something the gods would very much prefer he leave alone. None of them asked for the life they got. That's almost the rule. The heroes who go looking for glory tend to find the ending first. The ones who become legends are usually just trying to survive something they never chose, a father's cruelty, a stepmother's hatred, a promise made before they were born. The mother in the wooden box didn't choose it either. She was a princess once, locked in a bronze room by a father who'd been told his own grandson would kill him. He thought bronze walls could stop a prophecy. He was about to learn what everyone in these stories eventually learns. You cannot build a wall high enough to keep the future out. It always finds the door. Her name was Danae, the baby knocking against the piling in the dark, riding the tide toward a life he never asked for. That was Perseus, and his story starts with the man who threw them both into the sea. King Acrisius, A-CRI-C-us, ruled a city called Argos, and he ruled it badly, which was almost beside the point, because the thing that ruined his life had nothing to do with ruling at all. He wanted a son. He had a daughter instead, Danae, and no sons at all. And in a world that measured a king by the boys who would carry his name, that felt to him like a slow-motion insult from the god's dot, So he did what desperate men in these stories always do. He went to ask Dot there was a place high in the rock where you could pay a priestess to tell you your future. People walked for weeks to get there. They arrived hoping for comfort, and mostly left with a knife in their chest they'd carry the rest of their lives, because the future the priestess handed out was rarely the future anyone wanted. Perseus asked whether he would ever have a son. The answer came back sideways, the way these answers always do. "You will have no son," the oracle told him, "but your daughter will, and that grandson will kill you." Sit with how bad that news is. He didn't just fail to get the thing he wanted. He learned that the one child he did have was carrying his executioner inside her, unborn, unimagined, a boy who didn't exist yet and already had a job. A wiser man might have thought, well, prophecies are slippery things. Maybe I can be a good grandfather and dodge this. Perseus was not a wiser man. He decided the solution was simple. No grandson, no killer. All he had to do was make absolutely certain his daughter never had a child. So he built her a prison and called it protection. Deep in the ground or in the heart of the palace, depending on who's telling it, he made a chamber out of bronze, walls, floor, ceiling, a single opening for air and light. He locked Danae inside with a servant or two and no company otherwise, and he told himself the problem was handled. No man could reach her. No man could climb in. The math was airtight. He forgot to account for the fact that the being most likely to cause this exact problem did not need a door. Zeus, the king of the gods, the lord of the sky, and by a wide margin the least faithful husband in the history of storytelling, noticed the girl locked in the bronze room. What happened next the Greeks described gently, because some things you imply and move on from. He came to her not as a man, but as a shower of golden light, pouring down through the one opening her father left for the sun. And by the time the light faded, Danae was carrying a child. Picture Perseus a few months later. He's built the perfect prison. He's dodged the prophecy. He's feeling clever. And a servant comes to him, pale, and tells him the impossible thing has happened anyway. His daughter, sealed in bronze, untouched by any man he could name, is pregnant. He does not react well. Now, a normal man, confronted with proof that a god has taken an interest in his family, might reconsider his whole approach. Perseus doubled down. He decided the baby, his own grandson, a newborn who had personally done nothing, had to go. But he was also a coward, and a superstitious one, and he was terrified of what the gods would do to a man who spilled the blood of his own bloodline directly. Killing them with his own hands felt like inviting a curse. So he found a loophole that let him feel innocent. He would not kill them. He would simply put them somewhere the sea could do it for him. He had a chest built, a wooden box sealed against the water as well as anything could be, which was not very well. He put Danae inside it and her infant son in her arms, and he had the whole thing carried down to the shore and pushed out onto the tide. Then he went home and told himself the ocean had done it, not him, as if the distinction meant anything at all to a mother drifting into the dark with a baby against her chest. That box is where the intro found them, knocking against a piling, then not, carried out past the breakers, out onto open water, up and down on a swell that had no floor and no shore in sight. Danae did the only thing left to her. She held her son, and she talked to gods she had every reason to hate, and she asked them to be gentler than her father had been. The remarkable thing is that they were. The box did not sink. It drifted for a day or a night or longer, across water that could have swallowed it 100 times over, and it washed up, finally, on the shore of a small island called Seriphos. A fisherman found it tangled in his nets. His name was Dictys, and he was, by the standards of everyone else in this story, an astonishingly decent man. He pried the box open expecting salvage and found a half-starved young woman and a baby. And he did not sell them or turn them over or ask what a woman like that was worth. He took them home. He and his wife had no children of their own, and they raised Perseus as if he were theirs, a fisherman's son, on a small, hard island, learning to mend nets and read the sea, with no idea that his grandfather had thrown him into it, or that a mountain full of gods was already watching to see what he'd become. For a while, that was the whole story. A quiet one. The kind the world usually forgets. The problem was that Dictys had a brother, and the brother was king. His name was Polydectes, and where Dictys was kind, Polydectes was exactly the sort of man you'd expect to end up running a small island through fear and appetite. He noticed Danae the way powerful men in these stories always notice women who can't say no to them safely. She was beautiful, and she was alone, and she was a nobody with no father and no husband to make trouble. In his mind, that made her available. Danae did not agree, and for years the only thing standing between her and the king's insistence was her son, because Perseus grew up, and Perseus grew large, and a young man who is clearly going to become dangerous is a very effective way of making a king mind his manners. Polydectes understood this perfectly. He couldn't force the mother while the son was standing right there. So he did what clever, cruel men do. He stopped attacking the problem head-on and started planning around it. He didn't need to defeat Perseus. He just needed him gone, somewhere far away, on some errand that sounded like an honor and functioned like a death sentence. The trap he built was a masterpiece of social pressure, and it worked like this. He announced to the whole island that he had given up on Danae entirely and had decided to court a different woman, a princess. Well, out of his league, the kind of marriage that would require an enormous gift to even attempt. He threw a great feast and told every man on the island the price of admission. Each of them was to bring him a horse, a fine horse, a worthy horse, a contribution to the bride price. Every man in the room could afford a horse except one. Perseus was a fisherman's son. He had no horse, no herd, no wealth, nothing to offer but the fact that he'd shown up, and Polydectes had built the whole evening around that gap. When the young man admitted he had nothing to give, the king pounced, not with anger but with wounded theatrical disappointment. Everyone else had brought a gift, and Perseus, standing there with empty hands, felt the whole room turn to look so the young man did the thing the king had been counting on him to do. He got proud. He got loud. He said, "Fine, I'll bring you something better than a horse. Name it, anything, and I'll go get it." Polydectes smiled and named the one thing in the world he was sure would never come back. "Bring me," he said, the head of Medusa. The room went quiet, because everyone there knew what that meant, and it meant death. Medusa. Medusa was a monster out of the worst kind of story. Once some said she'd been a beautiful woman, and something had happened to her, something involving a god's cruelty and a goddess's rage, and she'd been transformed into a thing so horrible that the change was almost a whole tragedy. Now she had snakes where her hair had been, living snakes, hissing and coiling around a face no longer human, and her eyes did the thing that made her legendary. Any living creature that met her gaze, man, animal, anything with breath, turned instantly and completely to stone. Her lair proved it. The approach to the place where she and her monstrous sisters lived was, according to everyone who'd heard of it, a garden of statues. Except they weren't statues. They were men, warriors, hunters, fools with more courage than sense, every one of them frozen mid-step, mid-scream, mid-realization, at the exact instant they'd made the mistake of looking. A whole stone crowd of people who'd tried what Perseus had just loudly volunteered to do. You cannot fight a thing you cannot look at. That was the trap inside the trap. 100 strong men had walked up that path with swords and shields and confidence, and 100 strong men were still standing there, cold and gray and permanent. Polydex wasn't sending Perseus to a hard fight. He was sending him to a fight that had no known solution. An errand designed from the ground up to end, with the boy joining the garden. And Perseus, young, proud, boxed in by his own mouth in front of the whole island, said yes. He left the next morning with nothing but the promise. No map, no plan, no idea how to kill something the sight of which was fatal. Just a direction, roughly, and the growing understanding as the island shrank behind him that he had walked into exactly the trap it was built to be, and that the king back home was already counting the days until Danae had no son to hide behind. He wandered. He asked. He got nowhere, and somewhere out on that road, cold and lost, and starting to understand the size of the thing he'd agreed to, he ran out of everything a person can run out of except hope, which, in these stories, is precisely the moment the gods finally decide to show up. The gods finally decide to show up. 2 of them came to him, not as light, not as omens, as travelers on the road, the way gods do when they've decided a mortal is worth the trouble. One was a young man with winged sandals and a sly, quick way about him, the kind of face you instinctively don't trust and instinctively like anyway. That was Hermes, the messenger, the trickster, the god who moves between worlds and knows all the back roads of both. The other was a woman, and Perseus felt the difference the moment she looked at him. She was tall and calm, and she carried a spear and a shield like she'd never once in her life been unsure of anything. Her eyes were gray and steady and older than the sea. This was Athena, Athena, goddess of wisdom, goddess of war, fought with the mind instead of the temper. And she had her own reasons for wanting Medusa dead, old reasons, personal ones, buried in the story of how the monster became a monster in the first place. They told Perseus the truth no one on the island had, that the quest wasn't impossible, it was just impossible the way he was doing it, that you couldn't beat Medusa with courage, because courage made you look. You beat her with cleverness and with tools and with help, and they had come to give him both. But the tools weren't theirs to give. Not yet. Before Perseus could face the monster, he'd have to find 3 creatures no one had ever willingly found and get past. two more who guarded the only secret that mattered. His helpers pointed him toward the first of them, a trio of sisters who lived at the gray edge of the world and shared, between the three of them, exactly one eye, and they were not going to hand it over. The sisters lived where the light gave up. Not west exactly, not north, just far, out past the last places that had names, where the sky stayed the color of old ash, and the sun never quite rose and never quite set. Three old women, older than the mountains, older maybe than the gods who'd sent Perseus to find them. The Grii, the gray ones, gray eye. They had been old since the day they were born gray, born ancient, hair white as sea foam and skin like cracked riverbed dot. And between the three of them, they had one eye and one tooth. They passed the eye back and forth, hand to hand, so that whoever held it could see, and the other two sat blind in the gray light, waiting their turn. Same with the tooth, if they wanted to eat. It was a miserable arrangement, and they'd been living it for longer than anyone could count, and it had made them exactly as suspicious and unpleasant as you'd expect. Hermes had told Perseus why he needed them. The gray ones knew the way, not to Medusa directly, to a different set of sisters, distant helpful ones called the nymphs, who kept the three tools Perseus couldn't do this without. Nobody knew where those nymphs lived except the gray ones, and the gray ones weren't going to volunteer directions to a stranger who smelled of the living world dot. So Perseus didn't ask. He watched. He hid himself at the edge of their gray clearing, and he studied the passing of the eye, hand to hand to hand. One sister calling for it, another reluctantly giving it up, the eye traveling through a moment of pure blindness in the handoff, when no one could see anything at all. He counted the rhythm. He waited for the gap, and when the eye left one wrinkled hand, and hadn't yet reached the next, that half-second when all three sisters were sitting there, sightless in the ashlight, Perseus stepped in and took it out of the air. The reaction was immediate and awful. All three of them started grabbing, patting the ground, snapping at each other. Sister, the eye, give me the eye. I don't have it. You have it, you're lying, and slowly, horribly, it dawned on all three at once that none of them had it, that something warm and alive was standing in their clearing, holding the only eye they owned. They begged. Then they threatened. Then they begged again. And Perseus, who had learned something on the long road about how leverage works, held the eye up out of reach and made his terms very simple. He would give it back, gladly. The moment they told him where to find the nymphs, they didn't want to. They stalled and wheedled and tried to bargain him down. But a person with one eye between three of them cannot outlast a person with two good eyes and their entire future riding on the answer. Eventually they cracked. They told him the way. And Perseus, this is the part that tells you what kind of hero he was going to be, gave the eye back. He'd threatened them, but he didn't rob them. He set it in an outstretched hand and left them their sight and walked out of the gray the way he'd come, with directions to the last place he needed to go before the one he was dreading, the nymphs. When he found them were everything the gray ones were not, welcoming, generous, glad, even to help a young man on an errand the gods approved of. And they had the three things that turned a suicide mission into a plan. The first was a pair of sandals with small wings at the heels, the same kind Hermes wore, the kind that let you fly. No more walking to the edge of the world. Perseus could go up and over and fast. The second was a cap, a helmet of sorts, and it did something no armor does. It made the wearer invisible. Put it on and you simply weren't there to be seen, not by men, not by monsters, not by anything. A cap of darkness, some called it, a gift from the Lord of the underworld himself, on loan for exactly this. And the third was a bag, just a bag, a special satchel, and it seemed like the least of the three until you understood what it was for, because whatever Perseus cut off Medusa's shoulders was still going to be deadly. Her eyes turned men to stone whether she was alive or not. You could not simply carry that head home in your hands and expect to survive the trip. The bag was the only thing in the world that could hold it safely, a container that would seal the horror inside and let him walk away. Hermes gave him one thing more, a sword, but not an ordinary one, a blade of adamant, unbreakable, curved and cruel, and sharp enough to take a monster's head in a single stroke, because Perseus was going to get exactly one stroke and no second chances. And Athena gave him the piece that made the whole thing possible. She handed him her shield, polished on the inside to a mirror finish, bright as still water. And she told him the secret the 100 statues in the garden had died not knowing. You never look at Medusa, not once, not to aim, not to check, not for a single heartbeat. You look at her reflection. You fight her backwards, watching the mirror, letting the shield do the seeing so your own eyes never have to. The thing that killed everyone else was the instinct to look at what you're fighting. Athena had just handed him the way around it. So Perseus went to the island where the monsters slept. He came in on the winged sandals, high and silent, and he found the lair the way you'd find it from the descriptions, by the garden. Below him in the gray dawn stood the stone crowd. Warriors caught mid-stride, arms flung up, mouths open on screams that had frozen in the air years ago, some of them so weathered by wind and salt that the faces were softening, going smooth, the way old gravestones do. Every one of them a man who'd come here sure of himself and made the same simple mistake, and passed the statues. In the shelter of the rocks, the sisters slept. 2 of them were immortal monsters, unkillable, and Perseus was under strict instruction to leave those 2 entirely alone. The third, mortal, sleeping, snakes stirring restlessly even in her dreams, was Medusa. He put on the cap of darkness and vanished. He drew the mirror-bright shield and turned his back to her, watching her reflection in the polished bronze, edging closer step by careful step with the unbreakable sword ready in his hand. In the mirror she was a coil of movement, the snakes shifting, her face turned away in sleep, terrible even reflected in second-hand. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes locked on the shield. He lined the reflection up and he struck once, hard, backward, and took her head off in a single clean stroke of adamant. He didn't look even then. He reached back, still watching the mirror, and swept the head into the bag and sealed it away before a single drop of its power could reach him. Whatever was in that bag could still turn him to stone in an instant. He'd carry it the whole way home without ever once looking inside. What happened in the next moment the Greeks loved, because it's strange and beautiful and completely unexpected. When the head came free, something was born from the blood. 2 children Medusa had been carrying, fathered long ago by a god of the sea. One of them leapt up out of the ruin fully grown, a horse white and enormous, with wings. Pegasus, Pegasus, the winged horse, born from a monster's death, who would gallop up into the sky and into 100 other stories after this one. From the worst thing in the world, in the worst moment, something soared, but Perseus couldn't stay to marvel. The two immortal sisters woke Dot. They came out of the rocks shrieking, monstrous and grieving and immortal, meaning he could not fight them and win, meaning his only option was to run. And here every gift paid off at once. He was invisible under the cap. He was fast on the winged sandals. He went up and away while the sisters raged below him, searching for something they could hear and smell but never see, unable to follow him into the sky. He'd taken the one thing he came for, and he was gone before they could touch him. He flew home the long way, over deserts and seas, the deadly bag at his side. And the stories say that as he crossed one stretch of sand, drops of blood leaked from the bag and fell to the ground far below, and where each drop landed it turned into a serpent, which is the Greeks decided why certain deserts are so full of snakes to this day. A hero passed overhead once, carrying something that shouldn't exist, and it dripped. He was almost home. He had done the impossible thing, and that should have been the end. Except this is a Greek story, and Greek stories are never finished when the monster dies. The best part of Perseus's whole life was still waiting for him on a rock by the sea, and he was about to fly straight into it. He was passing over the coast of a far kingdom when he saw her, a woman, chained to a cliff at the edge of the water, arms pulled back against the stone, the tide climbing toward her feet, entirely alone. From the air she looked at first like another statue, pale, still, fixed to the rock, and Perseus dropped lower and saw that she was alive and terrified and weeping, and waiting for something out in the water that she clearly believed was going to kill her Dot. Her name was Andromeda, and she was a princess, and she was chained there to die for a crime she had not committed. Her mother had committed it. Her mother, a queen, had done the one thing that reliably ends badly in every single one of these stories. She had boasted. She'd claimed out loud that she, or her daughter, depending on the telling, was more beautiful than the sea nymphs, the daughters of the ocean itself. The sea heard. The sea always hears. And the punishment came up out of the water in the shape of a monster, a great serpent of the deep, sent to ravage the kingdom's coast, to swallow ships and flood the shore, and make the whole land pay for one woman's pride. The king, desperate, had gone to an oracle, and the oracle had handed down the same kind of unbearable answer these stories specialize in. The monster would only be satisfied one way. The princess, chained to the rock, given to the sea. So Andromeda's own parents, weeping, had bound their daughter to the cliff, had left her there as a sacrifice, and gone home to wait. And the whole kingdom had come to grief over a boast that wasn't even hers. And she hung there in the rising water, watching the surface for the thing that was coming to eat her, entirely certain she was about to die for nothing. And then a young man came down out of the sky. Perseus landed near her and asked her name and her crime, and got the whole terrible story. The boast, the monster, the oracle, the chains. And somewhere in the telling, watching this girl face her death with more dignity than the parents who'd tied her up, he did the thing heroes do at exactly the wrong practical moment, and exactly the right human one. He fell completely in love. He went to her father. who was watching from a distance with the mother, both of them destroyed. And he made an offer that was half rescue and half the boldness of a young man who just killed Medusa and was feeling capable of anything. He would kill the monster. He would save their daughter, and in return he would marry her. The king, who had been about to lose his daughter to the sea for nothing, agreed to almost anything faster than the words were out. Then the water changed. Something enormous was moving beneath the surface, coming in fast, a wake, a shadow, a rising swell that had a body inside it. The sea monster broke the surface and came at the rock and at the chained girl. Jaws and coils and cold black eyes, and the whole shore held its breath. Perseus went up. He met it in the air, above the water, on the winged sandals, diving and climbing and cutting, staying just out of the reach of those jaws, striking and pulling away, striking and pulling away. Some say he still had Medusa's head in the bag and used it, turning the beast to stone where it thrashed. Others say he simply fought it, played against monster the way a hero should, wearing it down with the unbreakable sword until the water went red and the great serpent finally sank and did not rise again. Either way, the monster died. The tide that had been climbing toward Andromeda's feet went quiet, and Perseus came down to the rock and broke the chains and lifted the princess free. And for the first time in this entire story, something happened that no god arranged and no prophecy demanded, and no one had to pay a terrible price for. A young man saved a young woman's life, and they wanted each other, and nobody had to die for it. They were married. And for once the wedding was joyful, and the kingdom that had been in mourning was suddenly in celebration. And Perseus, the baby in the box, the fisherman's son, the boy tricked into a death quest by a cruel king, stood in a foreign palace, with a princess as his wife and a monster's head in a bag, and the sudden strange realization that his luck had, against all odds, turned. He didn't know yet about the trouble waiting at the feast. Someone else had wanted to marry Andromeda first, and that man was going to walk into the wedding with a grievance and a small army. He didn't know about the long road still ahead, the trip home to Seriphos, the reckoning with Polydex, the mother he'd left behind, still cornered by a king. And he didn't know, because no one in these stories ever does, about the old man at the far end of his life, a grandfather, a prophecy that had thrown him into the sea as a baby and was still patiently waiting to come true. For now, there was only the celebration, and the girl and the sea gone calm at last. The rest of it could wait for the morning. Two snakes came over the edge of the crib in the dark, and the baby laughed. That's the first thing anyone remembers about him. Not his birth, not his name. The night the snakes came, he was still an infant, barely old enough to sit up, sharing a crib with his twin brother in a nursery in the city of Thebes. And in the black middle of the night, two serpents poured up over the wooden rail, sent by someone who wanted him dead before he could grow into whatever he was going to become. His brother screamed. Any normal baby would scream, but this baby reached up with both fat little hands, caught a snake in each fist, and squeezed, and the nurses came running to the noise and found one twin howling in terror and the other one lying there gurgling with delight, holding two dead serpents like rattles that had stopped rattling. That was Heracles. Heracles. And the person who'd sent the snakes was a goddess. His problems started before he was born, And they started at the top dot because Heracles had the worst possible parentage a mortal can have, which is to say half of it was divine, and the divine half was Zeus. The king of the gods had fathered him on a mortal woman, the way he'd fathered so many others, and this particular affair had enraged his wife past all reason. Hera, queen of the gods, goddess of marriage, and a being with a memory that never let go of a grudge. She could not punish her husband. He was the king. He was untouchable. He'd done it 100 times before. So she did what she always did. She turned the full weight of her immortal fury on the child. Sit with how unfair that is, because the Greeks wanted you to. This baby did nothing. He didn't ask to be born, didn't choose his father, had no say in any of it. And from his first breath, one of the most powerful beings in existence had decided to spend eternity trying to destroy him. The snakes were just the opening move. Hera would hound him his entire life, not because of anything he did, but because of who his father was and the insult his existence represented. He spent his whole life paying a bill someone else ran up dot, and here's the cruel joke inside it. Even his name was a peace offering to the woman who hated him. Heracles means, roughly, the glory of Hera. His family named him in her honor, hoping to soften her, to flatter the grudge out of her. It didn't work even slightly. She heard her own name on the child she wanted dead and hated him more. He grew up enormous, strong past explaining, strong in a way that frightened the people around him. A boy who could do at 10 what grown men couldn't do at all. And strength like that is a gift right up until the moment it isn't. Because the thing about a man who can break anything is that when something goes wrong inside him, he breaks everything. He grew up. He married. He had children of his own, and Thebes, a wife and sons, and an ordinary happiness that a man like him was maybe never going to be allowed to keep. And Hera, watching, decided the cruelest thing she could do to him was not to kill him. It was to make him do the killing himself. She sent madness. She reached into his mind and unmade it, poured a red fog into him, a frenzy, a total severing from reality. And in that madness Heracles could not tell his own family from enemies, could not tell his own sons from monsters coming to attack him. He saw threats where his children stood, and with those same hands that had strangled snakes in a crib, that could do anything, that nothing could resist, he killed them. His own sons, and some tellings his wife too. He destroyed the one good thing he'd built with his own strength, while a goddess watched and called it justice. And then the madness lifted. The Greeks did not look away from this moment. And neither should we, because it's the hinge the whole rest of his story turns on. Heracles came back to himself standing in the wreckage of his own family, his hands red, slowly understanding what he'd done. Not what had been done to him, what he had done. It didn't matter that Hera sent the madness. It didn't matter that he'd had no more choice than a puppet. His arms did it. His strength did it. The most powerful man in the world stood in the ruins of his home and understood that the thing he could never defeat was already inside him. He wanted to die. Of course he did. What do you do with grief that size, guilt that total? But the friends around him talked him back from it, and he did the only other thing a person can do with a thing that can never be undone. He went looking for a way to carry it. He went like everyone in these stories eventually goes to the oracle. He asked what he could possibly do to cleanse himself of something this unforgivable. And the answer that came back was the strangest sentence in his whole life, because it sent him straight into the arms of the very system his enemy controlled. Go to Mycenae, the oracle told him. Serve the king there. Do whatever he commands. Complete the labors he sets you. Do that and you will be purified. Do that, and here's the part that must have sounded like a bad joke. You will become immortal. The king of Mycenae was a small, frightened, jealous man named Eurystheus, U-ris-the-us. And he hated Heracles for the same reason small men always hate large ones. Heracles was everything Eurystheus was not: strong, famous, beloved, favored by a father who was king of the gods. By rights, some said, Heracles should have had the throne Eurystheus was sitting on. A piece of divine trickery had handed the crown to the lesser man. So now the greatest hero alive had to come and kneel to a coward and take his orders. It was humiliating by design. And Hera was delighted, because Eurystheus was hers, a pliable little instrument she could whisper into, a king who would happily hand her enemy one death sentence after another and call each one a chore. That's what the labors were. They were supposed to kill him. Every single one was chosen to be impossible. A task no man had survived, an animal no man had beaten, an errand at the far edge of the world designed so that the road itself would finish him if the monster didn't. Eurystheus wasn't assigning work. He was assigning executions, one at a time, and waiting each time for the news that Heracles wasn't coming back. The number kept growing, 2, which tells you the spirit of the thing. It started at 10. Heracles completed the 10. And Eurystheus, cheating, disqualified 2 of them on technicalities. That one didn't count because someone helped. That one didn't count because he'd been paid and tacked on 2 more to make 12. There was no fairness in it anywhere. There was just a frightened king and a vengeful goddess taking turns, trying to spend a hero's life. The first thing they sent him after was a lion, not an ordinary lion. The Nemean lion, N-E-M-E-, a beast that had been terrorizing a whole region, killing anyone sent against it, and it had a defense that made the killing easy for it and impossible for everyone else. Its hide could not be pierced. No spear went through it. No arrow, no sword, no blade of any metal. Hunters had emptied whole quivers into it and watched the arrows bounce off like the thing was made of stone. You cannot kill an animal you cannot cut. That was the puzzle, and a lot of dead men were the proof that no one had solved it. Heracles went into the hills after it, and the first thing he learned was that his weapons were useless, exactly as advertised. He shot it. The arrows glanced away. He struck it. The blade skated off the hide without leaving a mark. And the lion, entirely unbothered, turned to deal with him the way it had dealt with everyone else who'd come up the hill dot. So Heracles threw the weapons away. If he couldn't cut it, he'd do it the other way. He closed with the animal, got his arms around it, and used the one thing Hera had never been able to take from him, the same freakish strength that had cursed his whole life. He wrestled the lion, held it, and when he finally got his grip right, he crushed the breath out of it with his bare arms, the way he'd crushed the snakes as an infant, choking a monster to death against a body that no blade could open. Then he had a problem. He'd killed it, and he wanted to prove he'd killed it, and he wanted its hide. but its hide was the very thing nothing could cut. He couldn't skin it. No knife would touch it. He sat there with the greatest trophy in the world, and no way to claim it, until some say Athena gave him the idea. Some say he worked it out himself. He used the lion against the lion. He took one of the beast's own claws, the only thing sharp enough and hard enough, and skinned it with that, and skinned it with that. And then he wore it. That's the image of Heracles you carry forever after, the great hero draped in the skin of the Nemean lion, the head of it pulled up over his own like a hood, the impenetrable hide now his armor, a coat no weapon could pierce. He'd taken the thing that made the monster invincible and made it his own. When he walked back into Mycenae wearing it, Eurystheus took one look at the man in the lion skin and did something that tells you everything about who was really afraid of whom the king hid. He physically ran from him. And the stories say Eurystheus was so terrified after that first labor that he had a great bronze jar buried in the ground, a hiding place, a panic hole. And from then on, whenever Heracles came back from an errand, the king would climb down into the jar and give his orders through a servant, too frightened to be in the same room as the man he was trying to kill. Picture that. The mighty king cowering in a buried pot, the monster slayer standing above him in a lion's skin, waiting to be told what death to walk into next. That was the shape of the whole thing. A coward in a jar and a broken man who'd murdered his own children, bound together by a goddess's hatred. And somehow, out of that miserable arrangement, the greatest run of deeds in the ancient world. The lion was the easy one. It was strong, but it was one thing, in one place, and it could die. The next few would not be so simple. Some couldn't be killed by force at all. Some couldn't be killed at all. And one of them was going to grow 2 new heads for every one he cut off. A lesson, waiting in a swamp, and how the wrong kind of strength only makes some problems worse. The swamp breathed out a smell you could taste, rotting reeds, standing water gone green and thick, and underneath it something worse, a poisoned sweetness that came off the creature living at the center. Heracles waded in toward it, torch smoke stinging his eyes, and the ground got softer under him with every step, the way the whole labor was about to. The second monster was the Hydra, a serpent thing of the marsh, many-necked, each neck ending in a snapping head, and it had a trick that it killed everyone who tried it. Heracles did the obvious thing first. He got in close, swung, and took a head clean off. A good strike, a killing strike on anything else, and 2 heads grew back from the stump. He stared at it. He cut another. 2 more grew. He was fighting a thing that got stronger every time he hurt it, that answered every wound by becoming worse, and the harder he worked, the more heads came hissing up at him out of the writhing mass. This was the trap Eurystheus had counted on. Pure strength, the only tool Heracles ever really trusted, didn't just fail here. It fed the monster. Every powerful blow made the problem multiply. Some things in this world you cannot solve by hitting them harder, and the Hydra was a lesson in exactly that, taught in a swamp, at the top of a hero's lungs. He couldn't win alone. And here Heracles did something his pride usually wouldn't let him. He'd brought help, a young nephew named Iolaus, waiting at the swamp's edge, and Heracles called for him. Between them they worked it out. The heads grew back because the wound had time to. so they'd give it no time. Heracles would cut a head off, and the instant the neck was open, Iolaus would press a burning torch to the raw stump and sear it shut before anything could grow, cauterize it, close it, kill it. One would cut, the other would burn, and head by head, working together, they finally started winning against the thing that couldn't be beaten by force. There was one head at the center that couldn't be killed at all, immortal, deathless, so Heracles cut it free and buried it under an enormous boulder, pinned in the earth to hiss there forever, and the monster was finally done. Before he left, he did one cold, practical thing. The Hydra's blood was among the deadliest poisons in the world. Heracles dipped his arrows in it. From now on, the smallest scratch from him meant death. He would not think about that decision for years, but that poison was going to come back for him. Everything in these stories comes back. When he brought the news to Mycenae, Eurystheus, down in his bronze jar, did his usual cheating. That one doesn't count, the king called up. You had help. The boy held the torch, disqualified. It was nonsense. And everyone knew it was nonsense, but the king made the rules, and the king was frightened, so the Hydra got struck from the record, and the count rolled on. Heracles said nothing, and waited for the next one. They came at him now in a long parade, each stranger than the last, and the shape of the man started to change across them. The next few weren't about killing at all. They were about patience and cleverness, and doing the thing that couldn't be forced. There was a deer, a hind sacred to a goddess, with golden horns and hooves of bronze, faster than anything alive. Eurystheus didn't want it dead. He wanted it caught alive, which was worse, because you cannot overpower speed, and you cannot risk killing an animal a goddess loves. So Heracles chased it, not for a day, for a year. A full year of pursuit across mountains and rivers, never quite catching it, never quite losing it, until the deer finally tired and he took it gently, alive, and carried it back without a scratch on it. The strongest man in the world spent a year learning that some things you win only by refusing to stop. There was a boar, a giant one, savaging the high country, and again the order was to bring it back alive. Heracles chased it up into the snow, drove it into a deep drift where its own weight trapped it, and hauled the thrashing thing back on his shoulders. When he carried it into Mycenae, Eurystheus took one look at the enormous live boar and dove into his jar, so fast the stories still laugh about it. The great king, disappearing into a pot, while a hero stood over him holding a monster and probably, for just a second, enjoying himself. And then came the labor that had nothing to do with strength or speed at all, the one that must have felt like an insult even by Eurystheus's standards. There was a king named Augeas, who owned more cattle than anyone alive, thousands upon thousands of them, in stables that had not been cleaned in 30 years. 30 years of filth, a mountain of it. And Heracles, monster slayer, son of Zeus, draped in the skin of the Nemean lion, was ordered to shovel it out. In a single day dot it was meant to break his spirit, not his body. There's no glory in a stable. But Heracles looked at the problem and did the thing that made him more than muscle. There were 2 rivers nearby. He didn't reach for a shovel. He tore open the walls of the stable at both ends, dug new channels, and bent the rivers themselves to run straight through the place, and the water did in an afternoon what an army of men couldn't have done in a month, roaring through and carrying 30 years of filth out the far side and leaving the stables clean. He solved the humiliating task by refusing to be humiliated by it. He made the earth itself do the shoveling. Eurystheus disqualified that one too, said it didn't count because Heracles had been promised payment for it, or because the rivers did the work. Cheating again. The count rolled on again. They started sending him farther out now, off the edges of the known world, to the places where the labors stopped being about monsters and started being about going somewhere no living man was supposed to go and coming back. There were birds with feathers like blades, and he drove them off with a great bronze rattle and shot them out of the sky with the poisoned arrows. There was a savage bull on the island of Crete, and horses that ate human flesh, and each time he went, and each time he did the impossible thing, and each time he came back to a king cowering in a jar who found some reason it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. The tasks climbed toward the unthinkable. He was sent to the far west, to the very end of the world, where a giant kept a herd of red cattle, and where the sun went down into the sea, so far that the story says the heat of his journey made him furious enough to threaten the sun itself, and the sun, amused or alarmed, lent him a great golden cup to sail across the ocean in. He was sent to fetch golden apples from a garden at the edge of everything, guarded by a dragon that never slept. And to get them he had to trick a Titan into holding up the sky for him, and then trick him right back into taking it up again, because a Titan who's just set the sky down is in no hurry to pick it up. And then, last, they sent him to the one place no one comes back from, the final labor. Eurystheus, out of monsters, reached for the only errand left that he was sure would be the end. Go down into the underworld, he ordered, into the land of the dead itself, and bring back the guard dog of that place, Cerberus. Cerberus, the three-headed hound that stood at the gate of death and made sure the dead stayed dead and the living stayed out. It was supposed to be the death sentence that finally worked. You don't walk into the kingdom of the dead as a living man and stroll out again. But Heracles went down into the dark, all the way down, and he came at last before the lord of that gray kingdom and did the strangest thing of the whole set of labors. He stood before the king of the dead and asked permission to take the great dog up to the surface and back. And the king of the dead, for reasons the Greeks left mysterious, agreed on one condition. Heracles could take Cerberus, but only with his bare hands. No weapons, no poison arrows, nothing but his own arms against the hound of hell, which was, of course, exactly how he'd started. Bare hands against something that couldn't be beaten any other way. He'd come all this way through 12 deaths, and the last one asked of him the same thing the crib had asked of the infant, just his own 2 hands and the strength he never wanted. He wrestled the three-headed dog into submission, dragged it up out of the dark and into the daylight, and carried it, snarling, monstrous, and possible, all the way back to Mycenae, when Eurystheus saw the hound of death standing in his own hall. The coward's nerve finally broke completely. He didn't even try to give another order. He dove into the bronze jar and begged Heracles to take the thing away, to put it back, to just make it stop. And that was it. That was the 12th. There were no more chances to send a man to die, because the man had walked into death itself and led the guardian of it out on a leash. The labors were finished. Heracles was free. And here's the thing the Greeks were really telling underneath all the monsters. The labors were never really about the monsters. A goddess had put a stain on him he could never wash out, the ruin of his own family, the worst thing a person can carry, and she'd tried to use his own strength to destroy him over and over, for years. But every death she pointed him at, he survived. Every impossible thing he did. And somewhere across those 12 labors, the running started to change what the running was for. It stopped being a punishment he was serving and became a penance he was completing. The strength that had killed his children became the strength that cleaned the world of the things that killed everyone else's. He couldn't undo what he'd done. Nobody in these stories ever can. But he could spend the rest of his life turning the same terrible power towards something that helped instead of destroyed. That was the redemption, not forgetting the guilt. Outworking it, he wasn't done living. There were more years, more deeds, more love, and more disaster ahead, because a man like that never gets a quiet life. And the poison waited, patient, in the arrows and in a wound long healed. The Hydra's blood he'd been so clever to keep, circling back the way everything circles back. In the end it would be that old poison, not any monster, that finally reached him. But when it did, the gods did something they almost never did for a mortal. They kept their word. The oracle had promised, all those years ago in the worst moment of his life, that if he finished the labors, he would become immortal. And when the end came for Heracles, the mortal half of him fell away like the skin of the lion, and the son of Zeus was carried up at last to the mountain, up to the gods, up even into a grudging peace with Hera herself, the goddess who'd hated him from before his first breath. The glory of Hera. The name had been a joke his whole life. At the very end, somehow, it came true. Under a certain rock in a certain field, a king buried a sword and a pair of sandals, and then he left. He looked back at the stone once. He'd chosen it carefully, an enormous boulder, far too heavy for a boy to move, and he told the young woman standing beside him what to do. If she bore a son, she was to raise him quietly, say nothing, and when the boy was strong enough to roll that rock aside on his own, only then should she tell him who his father was and send him to find him, carrying what was underneath. Then the king sailed home to Athens, and the woman raised the boy alone. And the rock sat in the field waiting to find out what kind of man the child would grow into. The king was Aegeus, ruler of Athens, and the boy who eventually walked out to that rock was Theseus, the C-us. He grew up in a small kingdom far from his father, knowing his mother, but not the man who'd left before he was born. And when he was old enough, his mother took him to the field and told him the truth and showed him the stone. Under it, she said, your father left proof of who you are. If you can lift it. He put his shoulder to the boulder. The one grown man had been told a boy could never move, and he rolled it aside. And there they were, a sword, a pair of sandals, his inheritance and his summons. He took them, and he set out for Athens to find the father he'd never met. He could have gone by sea. It was safer by far. The road overland was infamous, a stretch of country crawling with bandits and monsters and murderers, each one running his own private reign of terror over a patch of the route. killing travelers in his own signature horrible way. Everyone with sense took a ship. Theseus, being young and having something to prove, took the road on purpose. If there were monsters on it, he wanted to meet them, and he did, one after another. There was a robber who beat travelers to death with a great club, and Theseus took the club from him and gave it back to him the way he'd been giving it to everyone else, and kept the club afterward, the way Heracles kept the lion's skin, a trophy that told you what he'd survived. There was a villain who forced strangers to wash his feet at the edge of a cliff and then kicked them off it into the sea. Theseus let him get close and then pitched him off his own cliff. There was a man with 2 beds who caught travelers and made them fit, stretching the short ones, cutting down the tall ones. And Theseus made him fit his own bed instead. Down the whole terrible road he went, meeting each monster with its own method, until the road that had killed so many was quiet behind him. And a young man nobody had heard of walked into Athens, having cleaned out the highway on his way to dinner. But Athens, when he reached it, was not a happy city. It was a city living under a shadow, paying a debt so horrible that the whole place had gone gray with grief. And the shadow came from across the water, from a powerful island kingdom, from a king who had lost a son and taken a terrible price for it years before. The king of that island, a mighty ruler named Minos, had a son who died while visiting Athens. Minos blamed the Athenians, and Minos was strong enough to make them pay. He'd made war or threatened it, and forced on Athens a tribute so cruel it's hard to say out loud. Every few years the city had to send a shipment of its own children, young men and young women, the finest of the city, chosen by lot, across the sea to the island, and the children never came back. Not one. They sailed away and vanished, and every family in Athens lived in terror of the day the lots were drawn and their child's name came up, because everyone knew what waited on that island, even if no one said it plainly. The children weren't being enslaved or ransomed or married off. They were being fed to a monster. The monster was the Minotaur, Min-O-Tor, a thing that should not have existed, the body of a man and the head of a bull, a creature born from a curse laid on the island's royal house, a whore the king was ashamed of and could not kill. So he'd hidden it. He'd hired the greatest inventor of the age, a craftsman named Daedalus, to build a prison for it, and Daedalus had built something the world had never seen. Not a cage, a maze, an enormous labyrinth of stone corridors twisting and doubling and folding back on themselves, so complex that anyone who walked in could never find the way out. They put the Minotaur at the heart of it, and every few years they sent the Athenian children in through the entrance. No weapons, no thread, no hope, and let them wander the passages in the dark until the monster found them. That was the debt Athens was paying when Theseus arrived, and he'd barely had time to be recognized by his father, barely had time to become a prince. When the day came around again, and the ship for the island was being loaded, and the young men and women chosen by lot were being marched down to the harbor weeping, and their families were weeping behind them, Theseus watched this happen, and made a decision that horrified his father. He would go too, not by lot, by choice. He'd take the place of one of the chosen, sail with the others as one of the tribute, and when he got to the island, He would go into the labyrinth and kill the thing at the center of it, and end the tribute forever, or die trying like all the children before him. His father begged him not to. Aegeus had only just found his son. Now the boy wanted to sail off to be eaten. But Theseus wouldn't be moved. So the king agreed with one desperate condition, a small heartbreaking arrangement that was going to matter enormously later. The ship that carried the tribute always sailed under black sails, sails of mourning, because everyone aboard was as good as dead. Aegeus told his son, "Take a set of white sails with you. If you live, if you somehow do this impossible thing and come home, change the sails to white before you reach the harbor. Then I'll know from the cliffs, before the ship even lands, whether my son is alive or dead. Black for grief, white for joy. Remember, Theseus promised." And the ship sailed, black sailed, out toward the island and the maze and the monster, with the prince hidden among the doomed. When they landed, the tribute was paraded before the island's king and court. The way it always was, the Athenian children displayed like livestock before they were led away to the labyrinth. And in that crowd watching the prisoners come ashore stood the king's own daughter, a princess named Ariadne, Er-E-Ad-Ne. And she looked at Theseus, and everything changed. She fell in love with him on sight, the bold young Athenian who'd volunteered for the maze, who stood among the condemned without the fear the others had. And she could not bear the thought of him walking into the labyrinth to die like all the rest. So she did something that would betray her father, her kingdom, and the monster that was her own half-brother by that terrible curse. She went in secret to the one man who might be able to save him. She went to Daedalus, the inventor, the man who'd built the labyrinth in the first place, who knew its every corridor because he'd designed them all. And she begged him for the secret of his own maze. How does a person get out again once they've gone in? And Daedalus, who may have had his own reasons to resent the king, who would later pay a terrible price of his own on that island, told her. The answer was so simple it was almost absurd, and it was the only answer there was. A thread, a ball of thread. You tie one end at the entrance, and you unspool it behind you as you go. Wherever you turn, however deep you wind into the maze, you don't have to solve the labyrinth. You don't have to remember a single turn. You just have to follow your own thread back out. The most brilliant prison ever built, undone by a piece of string, Ariadne took the ball of thread to Theseus in the dark before he was sent in. And she made her own desperate bargain, the same kind everyone in these stories makes. She'd give him the thread and the way out and the means to survive if he swore that when it was done he would take her with him, away from the island, back to Athens and marry her. She was giving up everything for him, her home, her father, her whole life, and betraying it all on the strength of a promise from a stranger she'd known for a day. Theseus swore it. Of course he swore it, and she pressed the thread into his hands. Then they came for the tribute, and led the Athenian children down to the mouth of the labyrinth, and one by one sent them into the dark. And Theseus went in among them, but with a sword hidden and a ball of thread in his fist, and one end of it tied fast at the entrance where the light gave out. The passages closed around him. The daylight disappeared behind the first few turns, and Theseus walked deeper into the twisting stone dark, unspooling the thread behind him, following the sound of something breathing in the black At the center of the maze, something with the shoulders of a man and the head of a bull that had been waiting a long time in the dark for the next meal Athens sent it. He didn't know how deep it went. He didn't know if the thread would hold, or if Daedalus had told the truth, or if the thing he was walking toward could be killed at all. He only knew there was string in his hand, and a monster ahead, and a whole city of grieving families across the water, waiting to find out if their children would keep dying forever, or if this was the year it finally stopped. The breathing got louder, and Theseus went toward it, and Theseus went toward it. The center of the maze was wider than the passages, a kind of stone chamber, and the floor of it told Theseus everything about what had happened here before him. Bones, the remains of the children, who'd come in the other years, who'd wandered the dark until the thing found them. And in the middle of it all, rising up out of the shadow as it heard him come, stood the Minotaur dot. It was worse up close than any story. The monstrous head, the horns, the eyes with nothing human left in them, set on a body powerful enough to tear a man apart without much trouble. It had been down here in the black its whole life, cursed into being, hidden away in shame, fed on frightened children in the dark, and whatever it had once been capable of becoming, it was only rage now. It came at him, and Theseus fought it in the near-total dark, at the heart of a maze, with nothing but the sword he'd smuggled in and the strength of his own arms. The details the Greeks left half in shadow, the way they always did with the killing, a struggle. The two of them wrestling and striking in the stone chamber, the monster's greater power against the young man's speed and nerve. But the ending is certain. Theseus killed it. He brought down the thing that had terrorized his whole city, that had eaten a generation of Athenian children, that the mighty king of the island had been too ashamed and too afraid to kill himself. The monster that couldn't be beaten fell in the dark to a prince with a sword, and the breathing at the center of the labyrinth finally stopped. Then came the part that made Ariadne's gift the whole difference between a hero and one more pile of bones. Because killing the Minotaur was never the hard part. Getting out was. A man could have slain the monster and still died in there, wandering the endless corridors in the dark until he starved. One more victim who'd won the fight and lost the maze. But Theseus had the thread. He turned around in the chamber of bones, found the line he'd unspooled behind him, and simply followed it, turn after turn, back through the twisting passages, winding it up as he went, letting a piece of string lead him out of the greatest prison ever built. He gathered the other Athenian children as he went, the ones still alive, still lost in their waiting to die, and he led them all out along his thread into the daylight. They ran for the ship. Ariadne was with them. She'd done her part, betrayed her home, and now she was fleeing the island with the man she'd saved and the promise he'd made her. In some tellings they even disabled the enemy ships so no one could follow. They'd put out to sea in the dark, the surviving children of Athens and the prince who'd freed them, and the princess who'd made it possible, sailing away from the island and the maze and the dead monster toward home. And on the way home, Theseus broke his promise. The ship stopped at an island along the way, Naxos, and there, while Ariadne slept on the shore, Theseus and his ship sailed away without her. He left her, the woman who'd given up everything for him, who'd handed him the thread that saved his life and the lives of all those children, who'd betrayed her father and her kingdom on the strength of his word. He abandoned her, asleep on an island, and sailed on toward Athens without her. The Greeks told this many ways, because it's an ugly thing, and they couldn't quite settle their feelings about it. Some said he was heartless, and simply grew tired of her, and took the help and discarded the helper. Some said a god intervened, that the wine god himself wanted Ariadne, appeared to Theseus in a dream and ordered him to leave her behind, so that the god could take her for his own. And in the gentlest versions, that's exactly what happened next. Ariadne woke alone on the beach, betrayed and heartbroken, watching the sail disappear over the horizon, and then the wine god came to her and made her his wife and set her among the stars, so that the woman abandoned by a mortal ended up crowned by a god. However you tell it, the fact underneath doesn't change. Theseus took what she gave him and left her on a beach. Even heroes, the Greeks kept insisting, are not good men. They're just the ones the story follows, and the broken promise came back for him, the way broken promises always do in these stories. Because Theseus had made a second promise too, the one to his father. The white sails. If he lived, he was to change the black sails to white, so that Aegeus, watching from the cliffs of Athens, would know from a distance that his son was alive. Theseus forgot. Maybe it was grief, if he felt any, over Ariadne. Maybe it was simple carelessness, the same carelessness that had let him leave her sleeping on the sand. But the ship came home to Athens still flying its black sails, the sails of mourning, the sails that meant everyone aboard was dead. And Aegeus was on the cliffs, exactly where he'd said he'd be, watching the sea every day for the return of the sun he'd begged not to go. He saw the ship, he saw the black sails, and he did not wait for it to land and prove him wrong. He believed what the sails told him, that his son was dead, that the monster had won, that the boy he'd only just found was gone, and in his grief he threw himself from the cliff into the sea and died. That sea is called the Aegean, Aegean to this day, named for the king who leapt into it, watching for a white sail that his own son had forgotten to raise. So Theseus came home a hero and a father-killer in the same afternoon. He'd done the impossible thing, sailed into the maze, killed the Minotaur, freed the children, ended the tribute that had bled his city for a generation. Athens would never send its children to die again. He'd be a great king. The city would remember him as one of its founders, its shapers, one of the men who made Athens what it was. And he'd bought all of it, without meaning to, with two broken promises, a woman abandoned on a beach, and a father dead on the rocks, killed by a sail nobody remembered to change. That was the shape the Greeks kept coming back to. The monster is not really the hard part. Anyone brave enough can face the monster. It's everything around the monster, the promises, the people who help you. The small things you're supposed to remember. That separates the heroes who die clean from the ones who live and have to carry what living cost. Theseus killed the thing in the maze. What he couldn't do was walk out of that whole story with clean hands, because almost nobody in these tales ever does. He'd become king now. There would be more adventures ahead. Theseus was the kind of restless, glory-hungry man who never stayed still, and more mistakes, and a long and complicated reign, and in the end a fall from favor as steep as his rise. but the boy who rolled the rock aside in the field, who took the dangerous road on purpose, who volunteered to be eaten to save children he'd never met. That boy had already done the thing he'd be remembered for. He walked into the dark with a sword and a ball of string, and he walked back out, and the monster that had eaten a generation was finished. The thread lay coiled and used at the mouth of the labyrinth. The children of Athens were going home, and a king lay dead in the water below the cliffs, and the sea took his name and kept it. A king was watching a festival by the river when he noticed a young man in the crowd wearing only one sandal, and it turned his blood to ice. Not because it was strange, though it was, because of a warning he'd been carrying for years, a prophecy that told him to beware of a stranger who came to him wearing a single sandal. And there, across the crowd, was exactly that. 1 foot bare, 1 foot shod. Coming toward him, the king was Peleus, Pel-E-us, and he'd stolen his throne. The kingdom of Iolcus was not truly his. He'd taken it from his own half-brother, shoved the rightful royal line aside, and made himself king by force. And he'd lived ever since with the low dread of a man who knows the crown on his head isn't his, and that someday someone might come to take it back. The oracle had sharpened that dread to a single detail: 1 sandal. So when the young man walked up out of the festival crowd with 1 bare foot, Peleus knew, the way everyone in these stories eventually knows, that the thing he'd feared his whole life had arrived. The young man was Jason, and he was the son of the brother Peleus had overthrown, the true heir, the rightful king, hidden away as a baby when Peleus seized power, raised in secret far from the palace so the usurper couldn't kill him. He'd lost a sandal crossing a river on his way here. He'd carried an old woman across the current, not knowing she was a goddess in disguise testing him, and the river had pulled the sandal from his foot. He'd come to Iolcus for one reason: to claim the throne that was his by blood. Peleus couldn't simply kill him. Jason had arrived openly, was recognized, had a rightful claim and allies watching. Murdering the true heir in front of everyone would turn the kingdom against him. So Peleus did what the cruel kings in these stories always do when they can't kill a man directly. He found a way to send him somewhere to die, dressed up as an honor. He welcomed his nephew warmly. He agreed in principle that the throne was Jason's by right, and then he added a condition, a small heroic errand, a quest worthy of a true king, a way for Jason to prove himself and win the crown with glory instead of just inheriting it. There was a treasure at the far end of the world, Peleus said, the golden fleece. Bring it back, and the throne is yours, Dot. He was certain no one who went after it would ever return. The fleece was exactly the kind of thing that gets men killed. It was the skin of a magical golden ram, a genuine wonder, and it hung in a sacred grove in a distant kingdom called Colchis, at the far eastern edge of the known world. Past waters no Greek ship had any business sailing. It belonged to the king of Colchis, a harsh and powerful ruler who had no intention of giving it up. And it was guarded in its grove by a dragon that never slept, a serpent coiled around the tree the fleece hung from, watching with eyes that never closed. To get the fleece you had to sail to the end of the world, get past a hostile king, and then get past a dragon that could not be caught sleeping because it never slept. Peleus offered all this with a straight face, as a gift. And Jason, young and proud and hungry to prove he deserved the crown, said yes, but Jason understood something Peleus hadn't counted on. He couldn't do this alone. No one could. So he did the thing that turned his quest into one of the greatest stories the Greeks ever told. He sent out a call across all of Greece for heroes. He was building a crew, and not just any crew. He wanted the best, the strongest, the bravest, the most gifted men in the whole world, gathered onto one ship for one impossible voyage. And they came. They came from everywhere. The greatest heroes of the age, drawn by the glory of it. The ship was built by a master craftsman and named the Argo, Argo, and the men who sailed on her were called, after her, the Argonauts, Argonauts, the sailors of the Argo, and the roster reads like a gathering of everyone who mattered in that whole world of legend. Heracles came, the same Heracles, the strongest man alive in the years of his own labors, lending his impossible strength to the voyage for a while. There was the greatest musician who ever lived, a singer named Orpheus, whose music was so beautiful it could calm storms and charm anything that heard it, and whose songs would save the whole crew more than once. There were twin brothers, sons of a god, who could handle any weather. There was the sharpest-eyed man in the world who could see things at impossible distances. There were mighty warriors and clever navigators, and men who each had one extraordinary gift, all of them packed onto a single ship, all of them rowing toward the edge of the map together. Some tellings even put a great warrior woman among them. It was the finest crew ever assembled, and Jason, who was not the strongest of them or the fastest or the cleverest, was the one who'd gathered them and the one who'd lead them, which is its own kind of heroism. The captain's gift isn't to be the best man aboard. It's to get the best men aboard and hold them together. And then they sailed, out past the safe waters, out toward the far end of the world, and the sea threw everything it had at them. The voyage to Colchis was a string of adventures, each one its own trial, and the Greeks loved every stop. There was an island of women who'd killed all their men, and who nearly kept the Argonauts there forever in comfort, until they remembered they had a quest. There was a blind old prophet being tortured by monstrous flying creatures called the Harpies. Harpies, winged things that swooped down and stole or fouled his food every time he tried to eat, slowly starving him. The Argonauts drove the Harpies off and freed him, and in gratitude the old prophet told them how to survive what was coming next, because ahead of them lay the worst obstacle on the whole route, a thing that had wrecked every ship that ever tried to pass it. The clashing rocks, two enormous cliffs, at a narrow strait that were not fixed in place. They moved. They stood apart, and then when anything tried to pass between them, they smashed together, grinding to rubble whatever was caught in the middle, and then drew apart again to wait for the next ship. No vessel had ever made it through. You couldn't outrun them. The moment you were between them, they crushed you. But the old prophet had told them the trick. Send a bird through first, he'd said, a dove, and watch. Let the bird fly between the rocks. The rocks will clash together to kill it, and in the instant after they clash, before they draw back apart, that's your one chance. Row through in that gap with everything you have got. So they did it. They released a dove, and it flew between the cliffs, and the rocks slammed shut behind it, catching only its tail feathers as it darted through. And in the heartbeat after the collision, as the great rocks began to grind back open, the Argonauts threw themselves onto the oars and rowed as they'd never rowed in their lives, driving the Argo through the gap. The rocks came back together behind them and caught only the very tip of the ship's stern, shearing off an ornament, missing the hull by a breath. They made it through. They were the first ship ever to pass the clashing rocks, and the Greeks said that afterward, cheated of a victim at last, the rocks stopped moving forever, and stood fixed and quiet from that day on, so that no ship after the Argo ever had to face them. They'd survived the worst of the sea, and at last, battered and thinned and amazed to still be alive, the Argo came to the far shore of the world, to Colchis, to the kingdom that held the golden fleece. But the sea had only been the first half of it. The hard part wasn't the voyage. The hard part was a king waiting at the end of it, a king who had no intention of handing over his treasure, who would set Jason a series of tasks even more impossible than the journey, tasks no man could survive. And the only thing in the whole kingdom of Colchis that could save Jason now was the last person Peleus could ever have imagined, the king's own daughter, a young woman with powers that frightened even the gods, who was about to take one look at Jason and change the ending of everything. The king of Colchis listened to Jason ask for the fleece, and he smiled the way cruel kings smile when they've already decided how you're going to die. His name was Eetes, and he was not a man who gave away miracles. But like Peleus before him, he couldn't simply refuse or kill a guest outright. So he did the same thing Peleus had done, the same thing Eurystheus had done to Heracles, the same move these stories run again and again. He agreed with conditions, a few small tasks. Prove yourself worthy of the fleece, he said, and it's yours. The tasks were death sentences, and everyone in the hall knew it. First, Jason had to yoke a pair of bulls and plow a field with them. Simple, except the bulls had hooves of bronze and breathed fire. Wild, monstrous things that had burned alive every man who'd ever tried to harness them. Then, once the field was plowed, he had to sow it, not with seed, but with the teeth of a dragon. And from those teeth, the moment they hit the soil, an army would grow. Fully armed soldiers springing up out of the ground, rising to kill whoever had planted them. Jason was supposed to plow a field with fire-breathing bulls, and then defeat an entire army that grew out of the dirt. Alone in a single day, Aeetes set the turns and sat back to watch the young stranger burn or be cut to pieces. And then the king's daughter saw Jason, and the whole story turned. Her name was Medea, and she was a princess. But she was also something far more dangerous than that. She was a sorceress, a worker of powerful magic, a priestess of a goddess of witchcraft, and her powers were real and deep and frightening. She had knowledge of every herb and poison and spell in the world. And when she looked at Jason, some say a god put the love there deliberately, an arrow of desire fired to make exactly this happen. She fell for him completely and instantly, and she could not stand to watch him die in her father's trap dot, so she made him the same. Bargain everyone in these stories makes. She would save him. She would give him the magic to survive the impossible tasks. She had the power to do it, and no one else in the world did. And in return he had to swear to take her with him, away from Colchis, back to Greece, and marry her. She was about to betray her own father, help a stranger steal her kingdom's greatest treasure, and give up everything she had, all on the strength of a promise. It's the exact shape of Ariadne and Theseus, and the exact shape of so many of these tales, because the Greeks kept telling this warning over and over. The hero survives because a clever woman betrays her own people for him, and it rarely ends well for her. Jason swore it, and Medea went to work. She gave him an ointment, a magical salve made from a rare plant, and told him to rub it over his body and his shield before he faced the bulls. It would protect him for one day from fire and iron, make him invulnerable to the flames and the blades. And so when Jason walked out to face the fire-breathing bulls of bronze, their fire washed over him and did not burn him. He seized them, wrestled them under the yoke, and plowed the field that had killed every man before him, while the king watched and began to understand that something was wrong. Then Jason sowed the dragon's teeth, and the army came up out of the ground exactly as promised. Armed soldiers rising from the soil, hundreds of them turning toward the man who'd planted them. But Medea had told him what to do about that, too. He couldn't beat an army alone, so she'd given him the trick that made an army beat itself. When the soldiers had all risen, Jason picked up a great stone and threw it into their midst, and in the chaos, none of them knowing where the stone had come from, each one accused the man beside him. They fell on each other. The whole earth-born army turned inward and slaughtered itself, soldier against soldier, until the field that had grown an army was littered with its own dead. And Jason simply cut down the last few still standing. He'd done both impossible tasks in a single day. The king had lost, and Aetes, watching, knew he'd been betrayed, and knew or guessed that his own daughter had done it. He had no intention of honoring the deal now. He'd cheat or attack or find some way to keep the fleece and kill Jason anyway. Medea saw it coming, so she made the final, irreversible choice. She would not just help Jason win the fleece by the rules. She would help him steal it tonight and flee. She led him to the sacred grove in the dark, to the tree where the golden fleece hung glowing, guarded by the dragon that never slept. This was the last obstacle, the thing you couldn't get past because it never closed its eyes. But Medea's magic reached even here. She used her spells and her herbs on the great serpent, singing to it, sprinkling it with a potion that did what nothing had ever done. It made the sleepless dragon sleep. Its enormous coils went slack. Its ever-open eyes finally closed. And Jason walked past the sleeping guardian and lifted the golden fleece down from the tree. At last, they ran for the Argo in the night, Jason with the fleece, Medea with him, the crew waiting at the oars. They pushed off from Colchis and out to sea with the treasure that no one was ever supposed to be able to take, and the king's ships came roaring after them in pursuit. And here the Greeks told the darkest thing about Medea, the thing that showed exactly what Jason had bound himself to. Because Medea had not fled Colchis alone, she'd brought her young brother with her. And when her father's fleet was catching up, gaining on the Argo, about to overtake them, Medea killed her own brother, killed him and cut him apart, and scattered the pieces into the sea behind the ship. Because she knew her father, she knew he would have to stop and gather his son's remains for proper burial, that he couldn't sail on and leave them scattered on the water. And it worked. The grieving king fell behind, stopping to collect the pieces of his boy, and the Argo escaped. Medea had murdered her own brother to save Jason and buy their freedom. That was the woman Jason had promised to marry. That was what she was capable of in his service. And a man who accepts a gift like that from a woman like that has bound his fate to hers. Whether he understands it yet or not, they made it home. After all of it, the voyage, the clashing rocks, the fire bulls, the earth army, the sleepless dragon, the terrible flight, Jason came back to Iolcus alive, with the greatest crew in the world, and the golden fleece in his hands. Having done the impossible thing, his uncle had sent him off to die attempting, and you already know, because these stories have taught you their rhythm by now, that it didn't buy him the happy ending. Peleus never gave up the throne, deal or no deal, and Medea, who'd murdered for Jason once already, arranged the usurper's death by a trick even darker than the last, so that Jason's return ended in blood rather than a peaceful crowning. And the two of them, Jason and his terrible sorceress wife, were driven out and wandered on into a future that the Greeks told as one of the great tragedies of all their myths, because Jason, in the end, did to Medea exactly what Theseus did to Ariadne. He took everything she gave and everything she'd sacrificed, and years later he set her aside for another woman, a younger royal bride, a better political match. He broke the promise, the way they always break the promise. And Medea, who had betrayed her father, murdered her brother, and killed for him without hesitation, was not Ariadne. She did not weep on a beach and get rescued by a god. She took a revenge so total and so horrifying that it became the definition of what a betrayed and powerful woman could do. And Jason, who'd gathered the greatest heroes in the world and sailed to the end of the earth and won the golden fleece, ended his life with nothing at all, alone, broken, and finished, undone not by any monster, but by the promise he didn't keep. The fleece was won. The voyage was legend. The crew of the Argo would be remembered as long as anyone told stories at all. But the man at the center of it learned the lesson these tales keep teaching, the one Theseus learned on the cliffs of Athens and Heracles learned in the ruins of his home. The monster is never the thing that destroys you. The dragon sleeps. The rocks go still. The army cuts itself down. It's the people you use, and the promises you break, and the things you're willing to do to get what you want, that come back in the end to collect. And they always, always come back. Always, always come back. Go back up the mountain one last time to the beings who started all of this, the deathless ones. They've been watching the whole night, a baby dragged from the sea, a man strangling monsters to outrun his own guilt, a prince in a maze, a ship at the edge of the world. And if you could sit among them and ask why they bothered, why the most powerful things in all creation spent their endless time leaning over the railing of heaven to watch for short-lived men struggle and bleed, you'd get an answer that says more about the gods than about the heroes. They watched because they couldn't do it themselves. That's the secret the Greeks buried underneath every one of these stories. The gods had everything, and because they had everything, nothing they did could ever mean anything. A god cannot be brave. Bravery requires the possibility of loss, and a god can't lose, can't die, can't age, can't fail in any way that lasts. A god cannot truly sacrifice because a god never runs out of anything to give. The beings on that mountain were beautiful and powerful and completely unable to do the one thing that gives an action weight. They couldn't put anything real on the line, and so they watched the creatures who could. The way you might envy something you're not able to feel. Think about what actually happened across tonight's 4 stories, underneath the monsters. A young man with empty hands stood in front of a whole island that was laughing at him, and instead of shrinking, he promised the impossible and walked out to get it. A man who had done the worst thing a person can do chose to keep living and spent his life turning the very strength that had ruined him toward cleaning the world of horrors. A prince looked at a shipload of weeping children being sent to die and stepped into their line by choice. A captain who wasn't the strongest or the cleverest man aboard his own ship somehow held the greatest heroes in the world together long enough to sail off the edge of the map. None of that is strength. Exactly. Heracles had strength, and it's the least interesting thing about him. The thing the Greeks were actually pointing at, over and over, was the choice, the moment a mortal who could have said no said yes instead, knowing what it might cost. That's the thing the gods could only watch. Courage isn't the absence of fear or the presence of power. It's a breakable creature deciding to act anyway, in a world that gives it every reason not to, and the gods, understanding this better than we usually give them credit for, did something strange with it. They tested it, constantly. That's what all the impossible tasks really were, not just cruelty, though there was plenty of cruelty. They were tests. The gods kept setting mortals in front of things that should have destroyed them, and then leaning in to see what the mortal would do. Would he break? Would he beg? Would he find something in himself that even he didn't know was there? Sometimes a god helped. Athena handed Perseus a mirror and a plan. A goddess in disguise carried herself across a river on Jason's back to see what kind of man he was. Divine hands reached down again and again to tip the scales. But notice, even when they helped, the gods never did the deed. Athena gave Perseus the shield. She didn't swing the sword. She couldn't. The whole point was to watch a mortal do it. The help was never the rescue. It was the god arranging the test more precisely, making the impossible merely almost impossible, and then sitting back to see whether the human had it in him. Divine help in these stories is never mercy. It's the gods refining the experiment, and sometimes a god did the opposite, and that's the other half of the testing. For every mortal a god lifted up, there was a mortal a god struck down for rising too high. The queen who boasted that her daughter outshone the sea nymphs and found her child chained to a rock for it. The king in every story who reached too far and got exactly what he reached for, sharpened into a punishment. The gods gave greatness with one hand and, with the other, made very sure it always came with a bill, because a mortal who won too cleanly, who never wept, who started to sound like he thought he belonged on the mountain, that was the one thing the mountain would not tolerate. You could be great. You just had to remember always that you were going to die, and they were not. That was the line, and the whole of Greek myth is drawn along it. On one side, the deathless gods, powerful, beautiful, and hollow, unable to feel the weight of a single thing they did. On the other side, the mortals, weak, brief, frightened, and somehow the only ones whose choices carried any weight at all. And the gods spent eternity staring across that line at the creatures who had the one thing all there power couldn't buy: stakes, a reason for anything to matter. The knowledge that the clock was running and that everything you did had to be done inside a life that would end. The Greeks weren't naive about their heroes. That's the part that still surprises people. These weren't clean, gleaming role models. Perseus threatened 3 blind old women and got what he wanted by force. Theseus abandoned the woman who saved his life, asleep on a beach, and then forgot the one thing that would have kept his own father alive. Jason bound himself to a sorceress who murdered her own brother, took everything she gave, and broke his promise to her in the end, and lost everything for it. Even Heracles, the greatest of them all, began his whole legend standing in the wreckage of a family he destroyed with his own hands. The Greeks looked all of that dead in the eye and called these men heroes anyway, because a hero, to them, was never a good man. That was never the definition. A hero was a mortal who did something the gods themselves couldn't do, and paid for it in a currency the gods would never have to spend. The goodness was optional. The stakes were not. What made you a hero wasn't your virtue, it was that you were breakable. And you acted anyway, and it cost you something real. And the gods on the mountain watched you do the thing they could only ever watch. And that, in the end, is why the storytellers kept turning away from the mountain. You'd think the most powerful beings in the imagination would be the center of every tale. They almost never are. The gods drift through these stories as forces, as weather, as the reason things happen. But the camera, every time, swings back down to the humans, to the ones who bled, to the ones who aged, to the ones who knew every morning that they had fewer mornings left, and chose, in the time they had, to walk toward the monster instead of away from it. There's a reason these stories are 3,000 years old, and still here. Empires that told them are dust. The languages have shifted, the temples have fallen, the gods themselves stopped being worshipped a long time ago. And the stories just kept going, from mouth to page to screen, across every century in between, because they were never really about Greece or bronze or monsters in caves. They were about the one problem every human being who has ever lived has had to solve. What do you do with the fact that you're going to die? The Greeks answered it with heroes. Not gods, heroes. They took the terror at the center of being alive, the short breakable span of it, and they turned it into the very thing that made a life worth telling. The clock wasn't the tragedy. The clock was the point. A story only means something because it ends. A choice only counts because you could have chosen otherwise and won't get the chance again. The heroes were how the Greeks said, out loud, to themselves and to everyone after them, yes, you are small, and yes, you are brief. And that is exactly why what you do matters more than anything the deathless. Things above you could ever manage. Look at what they actually gave the mortals in these tales. Never safety, never ease. The gods kept all of that for themselves up on the mountain. What the mortals got was the chance to matter, one life running out, with a monster somewhere in it and a choice about whether to face the thing or run. That was the whole gift. And the Greeks understood it was a gift, even wrapped in fear, because the alternative was the gods' own existence, endless, unbreakable, and empty, a beautiful eternity in which nothing you did could ever cost you anything. and therefore nothing you did could ever mean anything at all. That's the strange comfort hiding at the bottom of all of it. And it's why these are good stories to fall asleep to. Not because they're gentle, they're full of blood and grief and broken promises, but because underneath the monsters they keep saying the same quiet, steadying thing. Your smallness is not the problem. Your smallness is the source of everything that gives your life weight. The gods, for all their thunder, would trade it all, the power, the beauty, the endless time, for one real stake, one true risk, one thing that actually mattered because it could be lost. And you already have that. You've had it since you were born. It's the thing they were leaning over the railing of heaven to watch. The heroes are gone now. Perseus, who was pulled from the sea as a baby and grew up to save a princess from a rock. Heracles, who outworked the worst guilt a person can carry, one impossible labor at a time, and was finally lifted up to the mountain himself. Theseus, who walked into the dark of the maze with a sword and a ball of string, and killed the thing at the center of it. Jason, who gathered the greatest crew the world ever saw, and sailed off the edge of the map for a golden fleece, and won it and lost everything else. They lived their brief, bright lives, and they came to their endings. Every one of them, because that was always the deal, and the ending was never the failure. The ending was what made the whole thing count, and the gods went on. They're probably up there still, in whatever way stories exist, leaning over the edge of heaven, deathless and beautiful, and a little bit envious, watching the short-lived creatures below them do the one thing all that power could never. Why put something real on the line? In a life that runs out, and act anyway. The wind comes off the water, the way it did at the very beginning. Salt and wet rope, and the tar on the hulls. Somewhere out past the breakers, a wooden box drifts on the tide, with a mother and a baby inside it. And the sea, this time, is kind. Somewhere a man in a lion's skin sets down a heavy burden and rests. Somewhere a thread lies coiled at the mouth of a maze, and the passages are quiet at last. Somewhere a ship the color of legend rides at anchor, its crew asleep. The great voyage behind them, and on the mountain above all of it, the lamps of the gods burn low, and the deathless ones grow still. And even they, at the end of the long night, seem to settle into something like rest. The tide goes out. The story goes with it. And the heroes sleep. Sleep.